Have you found yourself in a place where there's just a relentless flow of worry thoughts from your brain? Like, what if I can't sleep? What if I never sleep again? What happens tomorrow if I can't sleep tonight? Or you found yourself in a place where you're constantly anxious or constantly in a state of fear. And you wonder, how can I arrive at a place where my thoughts are more pleasant and where I feel more peace of mind? Well, if this sounds familiar, then this video is for you. We're going to look at Befriending 2.0, Befriending in the context of our updated framework. And we're going to look at 3 practical insights, 3 practical steps that lead you to where you want to be, a place of peaceful sleep and peace of mind. Hi there, and welcome to this class. I hope it will bring a ton of value your way. We are going to talk about Befriending 2.0. Befriending in the context of our updated framework. And by the way, if all this sounds really, new to you and you don't know what I'm talking about, then maybe just familiarize yourself with the teachings. Check out some other classes before this one, or maybe just check the longer class, the one that's about 55 minutes from last week, titled Our New Way, and the thumbnail says Now to 2.0. That one will be a really nice kind of preview for a specific aspect of the updated framework that we're going to talk about here, Befriending 2.0. Now, the reason we're talking about this now is I saw 3 comments that had like a very similar theme, and I thought, okay, this might be something that we want to talk about now. In that particular video I referenced, the one with the thumbnail Now 2.0, titled on our new way, somebody commented the following there: how can I befriend fear? I'm paraphrasing. It wasn't exactly like this, but that was essentially the question. Now, there was another comment in another earlier video which said, how can I stop engaging with thoughts and just let them be? In fact, that was a comment in the my Insomnia Insight video, where I talked about this last thought, the last thought we have often before before we fall asleep, or before we really start struggling with sleep, kind of the last thought of the day. Under my class on that topic, this question was there in the comment, and there was another one. I think this was on one of the Ali's Take episodes, where there was a comment that said, how can I get rid of thoughts and fear? And I was thinking, like, the answer here is essentially the same. And the answer is befriending. The answer is no longer attempting to get rid of them. But the question, of course, becomes like, so how do I do that in a practical way, right? So let's start here. Let's start by talking about Now 2.0, where we learn about tokenization. So what is becoming a real cornerstone of our framework is this concept of tokenization. And tokenization simply means when our brain has identified something that is inherently harmless as a threat, as something dangerous, something we need to avoid. And the tokenization itself, or I should say that the fact that our brain has the ability to do this, that our brain has the ability to think of something that is not a threat as a threat, is actually a feature. Our brain is supposed to do that. It's supposed to be kind of cautious and be like, oh, maybe this is a threat. And then like, oh, no, it wasn't a threat. Maybe this is a threat. But sometimes it can identify something as a threat, and it fully believes that. And how we respond to that sort of confirms to it that there is a threat there. So, for example, our brain can take note of the fact that we are feeling scared and think, oh, this shouldn't be happening. Fear or feeling scared is a threat. We shouldn't be feeling scared. And what then can happen is that we respond to this in the way we would respond to a physical, tangible, a real threat, which is we would try to get away. So we would, for example, do some breathing exercises, or do some yoga, or go for a run or something like that, to see if we can push away our fear so we can feel less fear. What then happens, though, is that we are teaching the brain by how we're responding that there is a threat. If there wasn't a threat, then we wouldn't be trying to get away from it, right? So So in a way, the fear even more now appears to a threat, right? And now this tokenization can take on a life of its own, if you will, where the brain doesn't really see that there is no threat there, because we're in this cycle of trying to avoid fear, which creates more fear, which creates more attempts to avoid fear, which creates more fear, etc., etc. So we can see how we already talked about how emotions, or an emotion like fear, can become tokenized. Thoughts can also become tokenized. Themes of thoughts can become tokenized. Specific thoughts can be tokenized, like we see in the context of like OCD, where people think, or all of us, we've all experienced things of this nature, like where we think, oh no, I was thinking of, while driving, I was thinking of like driving off the bridge, something like that, or like, oh my gosh, I can't think that thought is unacceptable. This thought is a threat. This is an example of tokenization of a specific thought. Or we can have tokenization of a thematic thought, like, I can't think about sleep. Oh no, I thought about sleep again. Oh no, that's like thoughts about sleep are tokenized. So tokenization can occur in the context of thoughts, emotions, and a million other things, but this is what we're talking about here. So again, thoughts and emotions can become tokenized and appear as threats, although they are not. And I already emphasized how this can become kind of a loop, and explaining it from a sort of a traditional way of how our response of trying to escape amplifies the idea that there is a threat. But there's another way we can see this as well, or understand how we can have this loop where the tokenization doesn't self-resolve, and that is to talk about amplification. And amplification is another NATO concept that explains how thoughts and emotions become amplified, more intense, the more we try to get away from them. And the reason this happens is that thoughts and emotions aren't just some random things that exist to torment us or to amuse us or something like that. No, they are means of communication. When our brain tells us like, hey, it's sunny outside, and that's a thought, right? Our brain has interpreted some input and presents a thought to us like, hey, you should be aware that it's sunny outside. And maybe that's relevant, maybe that's not relevant, but it's just, for some reason, our brain just thought that you should know about this. We should become aware of this. So that's like a communication. The thought is a communication. Similarly, emotions are also communications. If we feel like scared and we don't know why, that's like our brain communicating to us that like that there's something here as a potential threat, right? We feel scared. Now, if you imagine that you had something that you thought was really, really pertinent to communicate to a friend of yours, and your friend sort of kind of brushed you off and said like, no, I don't want to hear about that. Then you'd go like, wait, no, you got to hear about this. That your communication has not been completed. Your communication has not been received. And you think it's really important for your friend. You love them so much. You really want them to hear this. You're going to try even harder. You're going to call them. You're going to go to their house. You're going to knock on their door. You're going to be like shaking them like, you got to hear this. And similarly, within ourselves, this amplification of non-completed communication occurs, meaning like if we have a thought and our brain thinks this is an important thought, and we go, I can't hear this. I got to go try to escape this. I got to distract myself. Got to do something else. I don't want to hear this one. Our brain's going to go like, oh my gosh, this thought was not received. This communication was not completed. We got to emphasize this. We got to push this harder. We're going to try even more, right? So this explains how thoughts and emotions become more intense the more we try to stop them. Now, this applies again to thoughts and emotions that our brain interprets that this is as something important for our survival to communicate. We can have fleeting thoughts, fleeting emotions that we can, just ignore, and our brain goes like, okay, that wasn't important anyway. I don't need to bother with that one, right? But when something to our brain is important and we try to get away from it, then this amplification will occur. And when we know this, we see that, instead of trying to avoid or get rid or avoid thoughts or emotions, we want to approach them in a different way. And we call that different way befriending. Instead of antagonizing or treating something like an enemy, we want to treat it as a friend, to befriend them, which leads to this, what this class is really all about. Like in practical terms, how do we do that? How do we befriend something? How do we befriend thoughts? How do we befriend fear and other emotions? And how do we not engage? Because that's the same thing. Engaging is, really, when we engage with a thought, it's in some shape or form, the intent is going to be to get away from it. In the context of insomnia and struggles there, the thoughts we're having are unpleasant. So the question of how do we not engage with them is very similar to, or it's really the same. The answer to that is really the same as how to befriend, because both of them are about non-action, which you will see. So in the past, when I talked about befriending, when we talked about befriending, it has been mostly in the same way that exposure therapy talks about exposure, or I'd say maybe people in the realm of exposure therapy and treating phobias and things of that nature talk about exposure therapy. And that is like an experiential thing that, when you have a phobia for spiders, for example, the exposure consists of maybe touching the spider or reading about a spider or something like that. But to make it a little bit more, practical or doable, we now think of befriending as having like these 3 aspects. And this, of course, applies to anything that's been tokenized, including thoughts and emotions. So let's look at this. Let's look at these 3 components to befriending. And this will answer the question of how to befriend thoughts and fear. So firstly, is just understand cognitively on an intellectual level that thoughts cannot harm us. They're completely harmless. And so are emotions. Emotions like fear or anger or sadness, they're by nature unpleasant. It doesn't feel nice to feel scared, but it is harmless. It is harmless. And somebody may say, "Oh no, there's evidence." That people always say that if you feel scared a lot, it can cause like heart attacks and things of that nature. But I'll say, no medical advice here, but I'm not coming across any evidence whatsoever that feeling scared, anxiety, sleeping a little actually causes any health issues. And this is part of befriending. Like the first component of befriending is to just understand cognitively, logically, intellectually that you are in no harm, even though the brain is screaming that there is a potential harm. Like there is no threat, even that the brain is screaming that there's a threat. There is no threat in the context of the inner struggle of insomnia, of the struggle with anxiety, etc., etc. And this can be really, really helpful in and of itself. Sometimes when we just intellectually, logically, cognitively understand that there's no threat, that can lead to change. That can lead to a place where the brain sees that, oh, there is no threat, then there's nothing for me to warn about. And there's less of the thoughts that we didn't know how to not engage with. There are less of the thoughts that we were trying to avoid. There's less of the fear. So this in itself can be really, really helpful. But sometimes we find ourselves in a place where we understand logically that thoughts and emotions are no threat, but we're still constantly experiencing fear. We're constantly experiencing these worried thoughts. And this leads us to the second component of befriending, and this is the exposure part, if you will. And it is really the same as acceptance. Befriending in this regard, and acceptance and exposure and letting be and letting go and non-reactivity is all the same thing. These are all words that simply describe the absence of an attempt to get away. And this is the part that can be so confusing, because you may have heard someone saying like, oh, what really helped me when I had insomnia was befriending wakefulness. I used to lay there with my eyes closed and just like praying for sleep to happen. And then I started befriending wakefulness. I started reading a book, and I started like watching some shows at night, or I just started resting there without an attempt to create sleep. And I started sleeping really well. It can sound like there is a prescription, like a recipe here. There is a a thing to do to show the brain that being awake is not a threat that leads where we want to be. So we can think like, aha, I need to do this. I need to do something fun at night. And doing that is really what's going to help. But what we're missing now, and this is very subtle, this is really tricky, but what we're missing is that effort the attempt to get away and escape is really to be understood from the perspective of the token, meaning if wakefulness at night has been tokenized for us, then when we're starting to read a book when we wake at night, it's not like reading a book helps in itself. It's that we're actually deploying less effort. We're doing less. Even though it optically may have seen that we're doing, it may look like we're doing more. It would look like, oh, now you're reading a book. Before you were just laying there with your eyes closed. You're doing more now when you're awake at night. From the perspective of the token, we're doing less. We're no longer lying there with our eyes closed trying to sleep. We're just reading a book. And there's less of an intent to try to sleep. So we're doing less now. There's less action. There's less activity. There's less effort from the perspective of the token. Again, I'm going to repeat this one more time because it's so subtle that. And let's use a different example. Let's use somebody who's been really struggling with anxiety to a point where they're housebound. They just never leave the house, and they hear that. It can be really helpful to face our fears, and they decide to actually leave the house and do things they did before and engage with life, etc., and they start to feeling less anxious. It can sound like that's the trick, just leaving the house, pushing through, doing what we want. That's the key. But again, even though it optically looks like this person was doing more before, they were always at home, now they're out and about, it looks like they're doing more. That's the trick. When we look at it from the perspective of the token, which was anxiety in this example, they're doing less. They're staying at home was just one big avoidance effort. Like staying at home and doing as little as possible was just a big attempt to have less anxiety, to push it away, to get away from it. But the leaving the house and kind of living life optically looks like, this person is doing more, but from the perspective of trying to control anxiety, they're doing less, right? So why I'm highlighting this so much is that I always see this confusion around befriending or around exposure or around acceptance, that it's something we do, where but when in reality, it's always about doing less. It's always about, non-doing. So again, befriending, acceptance, etc., they all just describe non-doing. And we'll talk actually more about this in a second. But for now, I wanted to talk about like the second component of befriending, which is non-doing. And thirdly, I'm going in a different order than I actually initially planned, but it makes kind of logical sense here. Thirdly, it is befriending ourselves, not being hard on ourselves. And this is another way of expressing self-kindness. This is the third component of befriending. And this is one of those when people go like, self-kindness, that sounds really flimsy and fuzzy, and that how's that going to help me? But I think this has helped more than anything else that I've ever come across. And one reason is that when we learn that non-doing, like not trying to push away the emotions, not trying to push away the thoughts, are going to lead to them bothering us less, then we can go like, okay, this is what I'm going to do. Like I'm going to, not try to push them away. I'm going to be brave, et cetera, et cetera. But then we find ourselves, not really seeing that much change. We find ourselves like we're still trying to escape them. We're still trying to figure out how to have less thoughts, less worry thoughts. We're still trying to figure out how to be less anxious. And then we go like, oh my gosh, I'm doing the same thing again. What's wrong with me? Why can't I get this? And this is self-criticism. This is us being really, really hard on ourselves. And that actually leads to more effort, because when we're hard on ourselves, we're like, I'm not doing enough. I'm not good enough. Let me try even harder. On the other hand, when we're like, we're doing what we can here. We're in a kind of like tricky way, because we're using the word doing here, but we're seeing the invitation to do less, but we're still doing a lot. Why am I this way? And so again, like the self-kindness, when we're no longer pushing ourselves or punishing ourselves, that leads to a place where the stakes are lower. Everything just gets easier, and it's a wonderful thing. But the main topic of this class was really to try to get as practical as possible in the context of like befriending or exposure, acceptance, or non-doing. And so I'm going to invite you first. So there's three more. I have three more banners, three more of these kind of like topics to go over with you. And one of them is just a question. If somebody asked you how to not do anything in particular, what would you answer? If someone said like, how do I not do anything in particular? You'd find it's really, really tricky to answer that question, because whatever you say can sound like doing something. If somebody says, well, how do I not do anything in particular? Then you can be like, well, you can just like sit someplace. Then they go, aha, okay, sitting is doing nothing, is not doing anything. So I'm going to sit here. And I'm like, I'm sitting here, so I'm not doing anything, but I'm still feeling the same way. Like sitting here has not helped me. I'm still feeling anxious, still feeling, still having all these thoughts. And then, you in this case, you're kind of the coach in this case, can be like, oh, they literally thought I meant that sitting was the thing you have to do, which is not do anything to escape those thoughts. Okay. And then then you say like, no, you're literally trying to sit down to deploy that as an effort to get away from the thoughts and emotions. And then this person may be like, okay, so what do I do then? So how do I not do anything at all? And then you see like, oh, this is really tricky, right? So this is kind of the first thing I want to point out, but you can point at that one. What would you say if somebody asked you how not to do anything in particular? And then I have actually 3 more things here. And this is the backseat kids analogy. So I have 2 kids. Not so much anymore, but when they were younger, we had this classical scenario of them arguing about something in the backseat when I was driving, let's say. And one of them goes like, oh, no, that book is mine. And the other one goes like, no, it's mine. No, I read it first. No, I have blah, 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 blah. And you might be tempted as a parent, and I've done this many times. And I go like, stop arguing, stop fighting, And that can sound very much like a command, like I'm commanding them to stop fighting. But in reality, what I'm doing is inviting them to no longer fight. Meaning, if they weren't fighting to begin with, there would be nothing that I could invite them not to do. And imagine if your kids asked you, like, oh, Dad, what do you mean? How do I stop fighting? You'd be like, well, the only way you can you answer that question is to say, well, what you're doing now, the screaming and fighting and arguing, don't do that, right? So again, saying like stop fighting is just an invitation to non-doing, but it's not like stop fighting is something you can do, right? You can't stop fighting unless you were fighting before. So stop fighting is just it's an example of non-doing. And in a similar vein is this other way I have of expressing this. Sometimes people ask me like, so Daniel, what do I do to no longer try to, like, what do I do to befriend, let's say, befriend my fear? What do I do to befriend my fear on a practical level? Like, how can you give me an answer that is really practical here? Then we can take note of how we have been antagonizing in the past. So for this, in this example, I would say, well, up until now, what do you typically do when you feel scared? And this person may say, well, I try not to feel like that. I try to calm down. I try to take a couple of deep breaths. I try to listen to a meditation tape. And then you can go. Then I would go like, okay, well, now you're seeing with clarity the things you have done in the past to try to get away, to try to antagonize, to try to reject. And when you're no longer doing these things, then you are befriending. So this can be really helpful if you can, if you think about the ways in which you have tried to escape your thoughts and emotions, and you see that, aha, this is the antagonizing, and the absence of this is befriending. That can be really, really helpful. And finally, I had this wonderful conversation with Sasha Stevens years ago. She's the author of the Effortless Sleep Method, and at that point in time, like the big question in my mind was how to quote unquote stop obsessing. I'd seen that so many of our followers and students actually understood that just thinking about the topic of of sleep all the time, and just quote unquote obsessing wasn't really helpful. It didn't like lead anywhere. And a lot of people also saw that if I just stopped obsessing, quote unquote, about this, my life would be so much more peaceful. So I was like, when you understand that there's no real threat, but you still keep thinking about it all the time, how do you stop that? I was like, how do you stop obsessing? I asked Sasha Stevens. And she answered in a way that I'll never forget. She said that, well, there's a built-in confusion in your question, because when you say, how do I stop obsessing? There's a built-in assumption that there is a way to stop obsessing, you know? So that can be really, really helpful too, to see these built-in assumptions in our own questions. When we answer a question, when we have a question like, how can I stop obsessing? We assume that there is a way to stop obsessing. I just have to figure out how, which has the built-in assumption is incorrect. There is no thing we can do to stop obsessing. It is just, an absence of quote unquote obsessing is non-doing. It's not something we can do, or how can I stop thinking about this? When nobody can willfully stop thinking about something. So when we say, how can I stop thinking about this? We assume that there is a way to control our thinking. So we stop thinking about something, when in reality, it's not like that for any of us humans. Now, we are 26 minutes in, and if somebody says this was so fuzzy and flimsy and unclear, I understand that. This very question was one that I think constantly about. How do we express not doing anything in particular in a way that it makes sense? And if you have something, if you, as you were watching this, were thinking like, oh, I have a much easier way to express this, Daniel's making this way too complicated, then please post that in the comment section so people can learn from your insight. But for now, I'll pause here, and I hope you found something of value here that leads you to a place where thoughts and emotions aren't bothering you. We all have them. We all have various thoughts. We all feel anxious. We all feel scared. We all have these emotions all the time. They're part of the human experience, but we can arrive at a place where they're not bothering us if we see cognitively that there's no threat. We're willing to experience whatever comes our way, and we're kind to ourselves. I'll conclude there. See you next time. Bye for now. Hi there, it's me, Coach Daniel, and I wanted to say thank you to everyone out there who is spreading the word. You know what I've noticed in the last 6 months to 12 months or something like that is when I ask people how they found us, one of the most common answers is, somebody told me on Reddit. And every time I hear that, it really warms my heart. It makes me so glad to hear that someone went out of their way to tell a fellow human about the Sleep Coach School. If you're one of those people out there spreading the word, I want to say thank you so, so much. And if you're not, then maybe you'll see an invitation in doing so, or you can simply hit the like button or hit the subscribe button. That alone helps so, so much in getting our teachings out there and helping more and more people in the world. That was all I want to say here. Thanks so much for tuning in, and can't wait to see you again.